this second commemorative lecture of the Faculty of Education. The lectures are held on an annual basis to commemorate the 37 years of service of Professor I.W. Haynes to the University of Cape Town and to the Faculty of Education in particular. We are fortunate to have Professor Haynes with us this morning, this afternoon I should say. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the speaker, the lecturer today, that is Dr. Neville Alexander, who is well known, I'm sure, to all of you, but I will nevertheless like to read to you some information about his background. Neville Edward Alexander, who was born in Cradock in the Cape Province on the 22nd of October 1936, and matriculated there at the Holy Rosary Convent in 1952, attended the University of Cape Town from 1953 to 1958. He specialized in German philology and history, obtained a BA Honours degree in German, and completed his master's degree with a dissertation on the Silesian Baroque drama of Daniel Caspar von Lohenstein and Andreas Gropius. In 1981, he obtained a D.Phil degree at the University of Tübingen in Germany with a dissertation on the dramatic works of Gerhard Hauptmann. After teaching German and history for 2 years at Livingston High School, Cape Town, and German part-time at UCT, Dr. Alexander was arrested, charged with and convicted of conspiracy to commit sabotage. He served his 10-year sentence on Robben Island, where he completed a BA Honours degree in history with the University of South Africa. While incarcerated, he was also very active in setting up classes, teaching fellow prisoners under sometimes very difficult conditions, and studying various subjects, especially history and sociology. From 1974, after his release from prison, until 1979, Dr. Alexander was confined by house arrest or banning order and was not allowed to practice his profession. During this period, he completed and published his first major political historical work with the title One Azania, One Nation, under a pseudonym. From 1979 until 1988, he worked for the South African Committee on Higher Education, SACED, serving as director of the Cape Town Centre from 1980 to 1986. Since 1988, Dr. Alexander's academic focus has been on research on language policy and educational innovation. He is the Executive Secretary of the HUSA Trust, which supports community-based self-reliance projects, and Director of PRISA, a research project for the study of alternative education in South Africa, which is located in the Faculty of Education at the University of Cape Town. His most recent publications include 1986, Sow the Wind, 1989, Language Policy and National Unity in South Africa, Azania, and 1990, Education and the Struggle for National Liberation in South Africa. Okay, the form the lecture will take us, I will now invite Dr. Alexander to address us, and he will be thanked by Professor Young at the conclusion. It gives me great pleasure, therefore, to invite Dr. Neville Alexander to address us on the status of the teacher in the community.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and it gives me very great pleasure to be able to deliver the second commemorative lecture, I.W. Haynes commemorative lecture. I remember Professor Haynes when he first came to the education faculty, and I was a BA student at the time, and he introduced us to the mysteries of the normal curve at the time. So it gives me very, very great pleasure indeed to be able to deliver this particular lecture. I must also begin with a very slight apology in that I've changed the title of the lecture slightly. Namely, I've called it The Position of Teachers in the Education Crisis. But if I may use a metaphor from what I believe is computer technology rather than the age of savagery, I have cannibalized a previous lecture on the question of the status, restoring the status of teachers in the community. So very much of what I'm saying here is something I've talked about at on other occasions on this subject. The education crisis, which is the aspect of the general crisis of South Africa's system of racial capitalism, with which we as educators are professionally concerned, has become the subject of diverse, urgent, and in certain respects, extremely resource-consuming attention. Despite a plethora of studies by some of our best research workers, strategists, and academics, we are nowhere near to what is optimistically referred to as the resolution of the education crisis. On this occasion, I do not intend to add another paper to the many reams of analysis. Instead, I want to focus for a few minutes on one of the central factors that will both help us to address seriously the immediate crisis and at the same time be the cornerstone of a radically new system of education in a radically transformed South Africa or Azania. There is general agreement among analysts on the origins, nature, and scope of the crisis in education in South Africa. There is agreement also about what is required in the short term to deal with what we can call the quantitative aspects of the crisis: pupil-teacher ratios, classrooms, etc. In regard to the more difficult qualitative aspects, it is agreed, among other things, that the invidious position of teachers is both a cause and a result of the crisis. It is agreed further that whatever remedies are prescribed, it is in the first and last instance the commitment and the quality of our teachers that will ensure the success or failure of our prescriptions. There can be no better occasion than the present, therefore, to recall briefly the basic issues involved in the position of teachers in the education crisis. First, the social position of teachers in the schools of the oppressed. It is axiomatic that no modern system of schooling can operate successfully without a body of motivated, disciplined, and competent teachers. In a society that is in equilibrium, teachers, like other social agents, carry out their tasks as a matter of course, even though this occurs within the parameters of the ideological, economic, and political preoccupations of the hegemonic class or classes, usually unbeknown to the overwhelming majority of the agents concerned. When, however, social conflict polarizes the basic classes in modern industrial societies, and when the conflict spills over into the schools, witness yesterday's events in Mowbray, teachers are among the first to become destabilized. Using Eric Olin Wright's model of social classes, Melanie Walker in 1989, an article written in 1989, explains this in terms of the contradictory class location of the category of teachers. Put simply, this means that teachers tend to be pulled in both directions. That is, towards the state, and hence the dominating classes, because their job security depends on this, and on the other hand, towards their pupils, who in a society like ours, stem largely from black working class homes. Walker points out that teachers, like workers, are employed by the private sector or by the state. I quote, "Like workers, they must sell their labor power in order to live. They do not control the apparatus of production, the educational apparatus as a whole. Teachers do not control schools. They do not draw out the syllabus, nor do they write the textbooks. Teachers' assessment function is carefully monitored and controlled by a vigilant army of HODs, inspectors, and subject advisors. Teachers are employed by the state to help maintain ideological control and to serve the political interests of capital. Nevertheless, teachers may potentially subvert bourgeois ideology at the level of ideological relations, given some degree of autonomy over educational production. So the degree of professional autonomy of teachers varies enormously across time and place." Close quote. Here we have in a nutshell the fundamental ambiguity of the social position of teachers. It is this contradictory class location that is the source of the agony and of the anxiety that most black teachers have experienced in recent years. It is because of the peculiar manner in which teachers are both limited and empowered that as a social group they have been subjected to such overwhelming pressures from the state and capital on the one side, from the mobilized and radicalized communities of the oppressed and exploited people on the other side. This has been true especially since the implementation of Christian national education, and increasingly urgently, often unbearably, since the student uprising of 1976. Vernon February, in the editorial introduction to his documentary study of the Teachers League of South Africa, writing in an almost tender, nostalgic mode, relates this ambiguity of the teacher's class position to their social standing in the community. In the relevant passage, he highlights the impact of racial discrimination on the class location of the teacher in South Africa. He refers to the economic importance of the teaching profession in the so-called colored community before approximately 1960. He could have said almost the same about Afrikaners before 1950, or about so-called Africans before 1990, or about all these social groups as well as so-called Indians in the rural areas of South Africa up to the present day. I quote, "There were very few avenues open to coloreds. In practically every colored family, there is a teacher. In a sense, in the discriminatory society of South Africa, upward mobility for the colored was possible only through the teaching profession. Although the schools were segregated, the teacher was largely free from direct white control in his daily interaction with his pupils. The teaching profession also ensured one a higher social status in the colored community." Close quote. At the age of 18 and even younger, the newly qualified primary school teacher would set out on a momentous journey through the well-regulated schooling system. At the end of the month, these young men or women would hand over their entire pay packet to their proud mothers and fathers, who in turn would give them their pocket money for the month. I speak from personal experience. I quote again, "The teacher was a person who, in West African terms, had mouth and knew book. And as such, his standing was assured." Close quote. 50-odd years ago, teachers were seen as the natural leaders of their communities. Together with preachers and a handful of lawyers and doctors, they were the mission elite, the chosen few who had the good fortune of some level of secondary and rarely also tertiary education. Ironically, among Afrikaners, teachers had a similar status at the time and for identical reasons. In the class hierarchy of the oppressed and disfranchised, teachers were at the very top. Because of their education and their relative grasp of the workings of the system as a bureaucratic organism, they were the eyes of their communities, those without whom the people would have perished. Their status was undoubted, and their creative energies had considerable scope for deployment. So large, indeed, did teachers loom in the communities of the oppressed, that their social leverage and their transformative potential was often overestimated. Ben Keys, one of the best educator activists this country has produced, writing in 1943 as a founding member of the Anti-Colored Affairs Department movement, the Anti-CAD movement, was moved to assert that teachers are the vanguard of the struggle for national liberation. In a decisive speech which he delivered at the founding conference of the Anti-CAD movement, 1943, he maintained that the whole people would have to be taken to school. Today, no doubt, we would be less sanguine about the political leadership qualities of teachers as a group. But at the same time, this view reflected accurately the pivotal position of the teacher in the community of the oppressed. I want to turn briefly to the dilemma of teachers in apartheid schools. The strategists of apartheid tried to use the schools in order to reinforce and legitimize their economic, political, and cultural visions. All of us are all too painfully aware of the nightmarish consequences of this all too successful policy, and I trust that I do not need to dwell on these. Today, we live in a world that is radically changed, one in which those who continue to uphold the letter of the apartheid script are like Rip van Winkels, wandering about in a world they do not recognize. Of course, the spirit of that script continues to move many who inhabit the corridors of power. Nonetheless, the confluence of global and national circumstances has created a situation in which important and even decisive changes can be brought about by a combination of strategy and organization based on a realistic assessment of both the direction and the possible scope of social development. It is thus necessary that teachers as a group consider their options in this rapidly changing situation. This is especially urgent because the era of school boycotts since 1976, with its attendant socio-political as well as pedagogical pressures on teachers, in black schools especially, has taken its toll. What Shirley Walters, writing in 1981, wrote more than 10 years ago is unfortunately still the norm in most schools today. I quote, Adjectives that seem to recur when teachers are described, particularly in relation to the boycotts, are anxious, bitter, exhausted, and excited. The anxiety of teachers seems to result from feelings of insecurity and their positions being threatened. Their professional identity is threatened by pupils who question their knowledge base. Their traditional authority is being undermined by assertive and responsible pupils. Most teachers have only ever played an authoritarian, traditional role. As psychologists point out, when the self-concept feels threatened, defense mechanisms result. So there are a lot of teachers participating in what is called survival teaching. Teachers continue to be rubbed between the upper millstone of the state and capital and the nether millstone of the militant working class communities in the townships. On the one hand, they are anathematized as government agents. On the other hand, they are subject to penalties that put their existence and that of their dependents in jeopardy. Teachers are still assaulted today, often by their own students. Principals still have their houses burned down, despite the fact that since Walter's wrote, many teachers and most teachers' organizations have identified themselves openly with the struggle for liberation. The destruction of what is now irreversibly labeled the culture of learning was described unforgettably by Zeke Bachlele with reference to the decreasing popularity of teachers among both parents and students. He described how people in the politically and economically disadvantaged community, I'm quoting, live under such perpetual strain and stress that its members begin to prey on one another. In South Africa, this underdog behavior, it's a glorious metaphor, this underdog behavior takes on excruciating dimensions to the point of freezing all communication and any effort towards self-liberation. Close quote. Today, we know all too well how teachers in the schools of the oppressed, generally speaking, have been landed in this agonizing situation. By 1976, the poison of bond education and other forms of tribalized schooling had wrought havoc in the body politic of the oppressed. Economic developments had begun downgrading the social status of teachers. They were now only one element of a numerous and growing class of relatively well-paid civil servants who themselves were on a par socially with other groups of middle-class people thrown up by the modernizing economy. Teachers were no longer the only ones who had a relatively high education and who could live in decent, well-appointed houses and drive about in shining cars. They were also no longer the only ones who had some understanding of how the system works. On the contrary, especially after 1976, when the system had lost all legitimacy in the eyes of black youth, teachers began to be seen more and more as a willing part of the system. Teachers, more than any group of the older generation, were the targets of the largely unwarranted accusation of the rebellious youth of the period 76 to 80, that I quote from those days: if you had done something about this system earlier, we would not now be compelled to sacrifice our education, our youth, and even our lives. That's what children used to say at the time. Some of you might remember. Teachers were particularly vulnerable precisely because they had been the ones who, by virtue of their education, ought to have known. They had mouth and they knew book, to use the West African lingo. Today, many of the younger generation realize that this simplistic political abstraction violates the real historical facts, that neither parents nor teachers passively submitted to the atrocious system of apartheid and bond education. They are uncovering the eloquent facts of the years of silence, from 1963 to 1976, when thousands of men and women vanished into prison or into exile. The fact remains, however, that because of the indefensible inequalities, inadequacies, and downright untruths of the racist education which black teachers were expected to dispense, they were caught in the crossfire between an intransigent, backward-looking governing elite and the resurgent mass movement of the oppressed people who were beginning to visualize a life after apartheid in the aftermath of the victories of anti-colonial struggles in Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and somewhat later in Namibia. The National Party government, partly because they had to, but also because it was good political strategy, had been buying off the teachers as a group by means of benefits of occupation, such as housing subsidies, medical aid, insurance schemes, and so forth. Most teachers were, and still are, hopelessly trapped in the constricting coils of the system. It is clear that the very first step we have to take if the status of teachers is to be recovered, that is, if they are once again to become the inspiring role models for the youth of today and tomorrow, which by and large the teachers of yesteryear had been for us, involves the systematic political education and organization of teachers who, in their thousands, will have to be made aware of the sociology and the political economy of education in apartheid South Africa, so that they can see clearly where they fit into this complex and tragic system, which it remains by and large today. For only if the majority of teachers acquire that vision will they be able to re-establish the umbilical connection between themselves and the children they are expected to teach, as well as with the parents of those children. Let me stress, even though it ought not to be necessary, that it is not only the teachers who have to be politicized and organized. The same processes have to be activated among students and parents. And I hope it is clear, I'm not talking about party politics, I'm talking about politicization in that fundamental general sense of understanding the structure and the dynamics of our society. No adult would willingly administer poison to his or her children, no matter how small the doses may be, if the cumulative effect is likely to be the same as a once and for all suicidal dosage. And yet, this is exactly what generations of teachers have been doing in our schools, if the metaphors we use to characterize boundary education are not simply ornamental. Since 1976, especially, the vast majority of teachers in the schools of the oppressed, who had known this before, have realized with irreversible clarity that this is what they have been doing for all the many years. This is one of the main sources of their feelings of guilt, impotence, and frustration. I am generalizing, of course. We all know that every teacher daily subverts the system, consciously or unconsciously, in 1,000 different ways, but on balance, and at the end of the day, most teachers are willing tools of social reproduction. Through their uncritical activities, the status quo is perpetuated, even though their children emerge, or more likely are jettisoned, from the system frustrated, rebellious, and even homicidal. Now, what is to be done? In order to change this situation, a radical transformation of pedagogy in the formal school system is essential. The present generation of teachers will have to be retrained, and the student teachers will have to be trained in the light of the requirements of a non-racial, democratic South Africa or Azania. Since we cannot expect the mandarins of apartheid to initiate this process, we shall have to find ways and means of doing so ourselves. Unless we begin to do this, not even the most progressive seeming educational initiatives can be implemented with some hope of success. We shall have to produce a core of well-trained educators at all levels of the system, people who can go on into the 21st century to run the educational system of a new, I say a new, not the new, South Africa. Such a training or retraining is just as much pedagogical as it is political, and we shall have to engage every available teacher and student teacher in this process. Progressive teachers' unions such as SATU are going to play the decisive role. The very first injunction to every teacher and every aspirant teacher is therefore that they should join such progressive teachers' unions and organizations. It is only there that they will learn or deepen their understanding of the relationship between what they do in the classrooms and what goes on outside those classrooms. And clearly, it is only if they grasp this that teachers as individuals and as a group will be able to regain, through their commitment to and their involvement in the affairs of the oppressed people, the confidence and the trust of those people. Extra and intramural activities must become part and parcel of a general educational and cultural politics. The renewal of education in South Africa will come from three sources, namely from our own experiences in the struggle against apartheid education. I consider those to be the primary ones. From attempts at reforming existing apartheid institutions, and from the experience of other countries, especially other African countries. At present, there are numerous pioneering educational projects which are exploring alternative curricula, syllabi, teaching methods, governance, control, and funding, as well as other relevant issues. The statistical details and the policy options, as well as models tried and tested in our local soil, as it were, are becoming rapidly available, and ambitious research programs are being undertaken by educational policy units and many other relevant instances. The more important aspects of all this laudable work are, however, the need to network and the need to make the methods and findings of the research the property of the teachers themselves, that is, of those who are going to implement these programs. Networking, another unavoidable buzzword, I'm afraid, is important, both in order to avoid the reinvention of wheels and for purposes of mutual inspiration and maximum impact. Democratizing the research process is a principle we should take to the utmost in practice. It is indeed one of the main achievements of our struggle, and it is to be hoped that independent teachers' unions especially will begin to appoint special task forces to make sure that their members, as well as other teachers, are involved in the renewal and rediscovery of education at all times and at all possible levels. Moreover, I might just say in passing that I consider that most of the teachers' organizations have abdicated their professional duties, and that there is too much emphasis on political pressure grouping, which is legitimate, and on the trade union aspects of teacher organization, again, very legitimately so. But I believe that the professional aspect of teachers' organizations is being, at the very least, neglected, in most cases ignored. And without that, you're not going to get a body of teachers that understands, that is competent, and that is motivated. Moreover, we are living through a period in which practices of democratic consultation are becoming obligatory among more and more constituencies. It is certainly no longer acceptable that parents and senior students, as well as the relevant business, labor, community, and cultural organizations and institutions, be left out of the process of curriculum development. The days when groups of bureaucrats and most favored teacher representatives could incestuously turn out syllabi are fast coming to an end. Ordinary people have begun to realize that what their children learn at school is not a matter of indifference to them. Parent involvement in education is becoming a demand and a slogan that cannot be ignored. This means, and will increasingly mean, that democratic methods of curriculum design and course development will have to be found. All of us know how problematic such a process can be, but most of us, I'm sure, realize that if we can find such mechanisms and entrench such practices, we shall have gone very far along the road of empowering local, regional, and national communities in this vital area. Authoritarian, top-down, talk-and-chalk methods of teaching are beginning to be questioned even in the conventional classrooms and schools. However, there is a very long road ahead, because the tenacious hold of these methods, that such methods have on teachers, is a function of their insecurity, teachers' insecurity, and academic and professional incompetence. Teachers should be encouraged to find the best methods to teach particular segments of knowledge or skills. These methods are always dependent on the unique personality of the teacher. And for this reason, any attempt to find neat Spencerian formulae, such as working from the concrete to the abstract, or moving from the particular to the general, all these hallowed truths of classical pedagogies are quite simply futile and irrelevant. Situations are never identical, and what works in one situation will not necessarily work in another. Principles are everything. The tactics of translating them into practice must remain within the control of the individual teacher. It must be the goal of teachers as a group to acquire maximum discretion in regard to the tools of their trade, especially in such matters as prescribed textbooks and other materials, teaching methods, and in respect of elective areas of syllabi. Such a goal, which must become a highly profiled demand, presupposes a self-confidence that comes from academic and professional competence. The present situation, where a given number of approved textbooks restricts the choice which teachers have, besides nurturing the soil in which all manner of possible corruption due to vested interests can thrive, leads to alienation of teachers who may have serious objections to the ideology and methodology of the prescribed texts. As long as the core skills and knowledge at the appropriate levels are being addressed, it seems to me that teachers ought to be given a free hand in the choice of books and materials. In order to anticipate the objection that this could lead to chaos and to a disastrous lowering of standards, I hasten to add that the corollary to this particular demand or goal must be the establishment of subject teacher associations which will be competent precisely to monitor standards and to facilitate the exploration of new methods. I'd like to conclude. I should like to say that it ought to be clear that I focused on the problem of teacher training within the broader socio-historical context of the restoration of the status of teachers in the community, because I believe that this is one of the keys to our escaping from what one can only call an arousal syndrome, which has taken hold of so many of our youth. Let me hasten to say that it is a matter that in most cases is quite beyond their control. Knee-jerk, long-term, and even indefinite school boycotts as a weapon with which to retaliate to some real or supposed act of oppression and repression on the part of racist authorities inside or outside schools have taken a devastating toll. In many parts of the country and in many townships, a vicious anti-educational cycle has come into being. It is my contention that besides the authentic, representative political organizations of the oppressed people, much can be done to break that cycle by teachers' organizations, as well as by colleges and faculties of education. We need to create the conditions in which a core of inspired and highly motivated teachers, having as clear an understanding as is possible of the present conjuncture in the world and in South Africa, and being dedicated to the cherished principles of our liberation struggle for a non-racial, non-sexist democracy, can once again become role models for our devastated youth. Clearly, this is not simply a subjective matter. Benevolent intentions are a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the change I am pleading for. Hard-nosed political strategy and mass action, together with conferences, discussions, seminars, arm-twisting, and lobbying, are the warp and hoof into which teachers shall have to knit their plans for the renewal and rediscovery of education in South Africa, Zambia. To believe that it is possible to depoliticize education, especially in such a complex and conflict-ridden country as ours, is and will remain for a long time to capitulate to the powers that be. That is, to become a willing tool of the status quo. I know from personal experience that it takes some courage to set out on this new road. It is a road that leads one into many confrontations with those who are walking in the opposite direction. On the other hand, there is real comfort in the knowledge that those of us who have chosen this way are in some sense carried along by the surging mass of our people in desperate quest of the realization of our dream of a democratic South Africa, Zambia, a country free of exploitation, oppression, and all forms of discrimination. Thank you.
Many of us have had the privilege of hearing Neville speak in this lecture theatre several times, and each time he speaks, he does at least three things. He's always controversial. Each time I hear Neville, it gets more and more controversial in many senses. But he radically defies labeling into one particular position, and in so doing, he also, I think, contributes to two contradictory reactions, certainly in myself. I feel very uncomfortable for the truth that he is pushing home and probing me with, and I'm sure many other people. also the inspiration and the offerings of solutions that he puts forward. And for all those things, Neville, I'd like to thank you on behalf of everybody here and offer you this small token of appreciation. Thank you.